A woman being loved felt like facing a guillotine, all because she glanced at an adult novel. This execution scene was fully taken in by a count named Sade. He immediately picked up a quill pen, dipped it in red ink, and using this woman as his model, he wrote another risque story that shocked the world. 200 years ago was the European Age of Enlightenment, and it was also a golden era for bold and liberated thinking. People at that time began to challenge the power of both the church and the monarchy, and many works involving intimate themes reached unprecedented heights. This man, the Marquis de Sade, was a leading figure in the field of provocative literature, but Sade was not only devoted to pleasure, he also loved practicing dominance and submission, and the term came from the initials of his own name. Of course, Sade ended up in prison many times because of this, but his wild writing style never changed. The authorities eventually had no choice but to send him to a psychiatric institution. This place could provide Sade with daily meals, but he had to stay in his room all day. He was not allowed out, and he was forbidden to send his writings to the outside world. Without readers, Sade would wither, so he found a devoted female admirer to help him deliver his work beyond those walls. Every time a manuscript was finished, he secretly slipped it through a small window to a female caretaker, and she would take it to a publisher outside. Before long, these freshly printed risque books were spreading through the streets of Paris again. People passed them around the moment they got their hands on them, and eventually, the news reached Emperor Napoleon. When he learned of it, he flew into a rage and immediately ordered all such books destroyed. And as for their creator, he wanted the matter ended once and for all. After this command was issued, a minister advised Napoleon to retract it because Sade was still a noble, and executing a noble would harm his reputation, but saving a noble could win him the hearts of people everywhere. So the minister recommended a veteran psychiatrist and asked this doctor to cure Sade. This doctor had an excellent public reputation. On the surface, he appeared to have noble morals and flawless conduct. Many patients with mental illnesses recovered well under his treatment, but in reality, the methods he used behind closed doors relied entirely on punishment to force his patients back to normal. He was, in every sense, a tyrant. The doctor also had a weakness, which was his fondness for beauty. He had a young and attractive wife, and although he was brutal toward his patients, he was exceptionally attentive to her. He lived in the largest house, hired the most famous architect for renovations, installed the brightest tiles, and laid the most expensive carpets. In short, he never wanted the best. He only wanted the most expensive, but he had only one small request, which was that the doors and windows of his wife's room must be fitted with bars to prevent her from getting close to anyone else. The doctor wanted to raise her like a precious golden canary.
She is a rare bird. I intend to keep her caged.
However, the director of the asylum where Sade was held was completely different from the doctor in character. He was a priest who showed kindness to everyone around him, especially this laundry maid. It was obvious that the priest liked her, but faith required him to keep her pure. He could entertain thoughts of affection, but nothing substantial was allowed to happen. What the priest did not know was that the maid was actually a devoted fan of Sade, and she always looked for chances to help Sade send his risque writings to the outside world. And this connection would become a huge hidden danger later. The doctor came to the asylum carrying Napoleon's orders, so his authority was higher than the priest's. To welcome the doctor, the priest specially organized the patients to rehearse a choir performance, but the doctor did not want to waste time, and he handed the newly published risque book to the priest. The priest turned pale after reading it, shocked that there was an insider sending such material out from within the asylum. Now he understood why a new superior had suddenly been sent to take over. The doctor disliked beating around the bush, and after ordering his men to bring torture devices, he immediately tried to inflict severe punishment on Sade. The kind priest stepped in to stop him, believing that Sade could be persuaded and that things should not escalate to violence. So the priest went to speak with Sade, hoping he would stop writing adult-themed stories. If he truly wanted to create, he could write about elegant and beautiful things, but Sade refused, saying he only wished to praise the most real and primal desires. As for words that glorified peace and prosperity, he had no interest in them at all. How could a priest convince someone seen as unstable? But in front of the doctor, the priest promised that such writings should no longer appear. But before long, what was destined to happen still happened. Rumors spread that the doctor did not treat his wife kindly. He spoke publicly about attacking risque literature, but many of the behaviors described in those books were things he had done to his wife. These rumors, passed on by the maid, eventually reached Sade's ears. Coincidentally, a ball was being held to welcome the doctor, so Sade decided to stage a play as a grand gift to him. On the night of the ball, the doctor was unbearably embarrassed. The performance was far too provocative, filled with scenes that were difficult to watch. Although the audience was excited, the doctor was sweating through his clothes. Even the priest looked awkward, taking out his cross and pleading for forgiveness from above. At that moment, the doctor could think of only one thing: for the well-being of the people of France. He had to cure Sade using any method necessary, but the priest was still trying to argue for mercy. He confiscated Sade's quill, paper, and ink, and threw a Bible to him instead. Sade made the Bible spit out a mouthful of disdain. He could not understand why anyone would read the words of someone who allowed his own son to be put to death. Seeing Sade insult the Bible strengthened the priest's belief that he needed to confiscate all writing materials, but a living person cannot be stopped so easily. One day at a meal, Sade discovered that red wine could leave outlines on white cloth. Was this not ready-made ink and paper? And with some modification, the chicken bones after the meal could also become a pen. Once he had the tools, all the inspiration he had been suppressing poured onto the cloth. And this time, the main character of his story was the doctor himself. An older man and a young woman together. This relationship was naturally the perfect ground for a story. When the maid saw the cloth full of writing, she was overjoyed. She copied it onto paper while reading it aloud to her blind mother. Even a woman of her mother's age exclaimed with delight after hearing it. It was clear that this story would cause another stir, but no one is a fool. After washing the cloth, the basin full of purple liquid made the doctor suspicious. Thinking it through, the only person close enough to Sade was the maid. Realizing that the matter could affect the woman he cared for, the priest could no longer sit still. He then confiscated all fabric items in Sade's room. No more red wine, no more chicken. This was the punishment Sade deserved. Although the risque book starring the doctor remained popular in the market, in reality, the doctor and his wife were not at all as passionate as the story described. Since moving in, the doctor's wife had spent her days reading books to pass the time. When the doctor tried to be close to her, she showed no response, and the reason she behaved this way was simply because she did not like the doctor as a person. Recently, after hearing that a certain book with adult themes was selling extremely well, the wife bought a copy with a try-it attitude. To keep the doctor from finding out, she even covered it with the dust jacket of another poetry book. From then on, the doctor's wife read almost every day, and the more she read, the redder her face became. But the doctor had no idea and was delighted that she seemed to enjoy elegant poetry. Meanwhile, for the sake of writing, Sade had gone completely unrestrained. He smashed a mirror, used the glass to cut his finger, and used his own blood as ink to continue pouring out his imagination. Even though he became anemic, Sade still did it tirelessly. He asked the maid to come in and check the results. The maid never imagined that Sade would actually write a story on his clothes. A seamless piece like this would naturally become even more sensational. Sade also took the chance to rush out of his cell, run to the dining hall, and show his masterpiece to the other patients.
Beast, back to his cage. I won't sully my hands.
Just as the doctor prepared to use water punishment on him, the priest once again showed compassion and stopped him. He ordered Sade to take off his clothes and remove his wig. With that, the priest could guarantee 100% that Sade would never be able to write again. However, the doctor's anger towards Sade still had not subsided. At that moment he needed to whip someone to vent it. Since the maid had let Sade escape, she should be punished. Seeing this, the priest rushed onto the stage without hesitation. "If you must strike someone, strike me." The moment he said this, the crowd erupted. Even the doctor was shocked. In the eyes of the French, for a priest to ignore serving a higher calling and undress for a maid was an unthinkable act. In truth, the maid also had feelings for the priest who had always cared for her, but because of their positions, she never expressed it. Since things had come this far, the maid no longer hid her feelings. That night, she slipped into the priest's room, but reason told the priest he must keep his body pure. In the end, he still pushed the maid out, and because of this rejection, the maid began distancing herself from the priest. The priest failed to gain love, while the doctor was worse off, because he received the humiliation of betrayal. He thought that installing iron bars would ensure his wife belonged only to him, but he never expected his wife to get involved with the worker who installed the bars. When she handed the worker that book with adult themes, the two immediately connected and acted as if they had known each other forever, but they still had to think about their future. So the worker wrote the doctor a farewell letter. In the letter he said, your room has been renovated as requested, but as for the lady of that room, I've decided to take her with me." The doctor nearly fainted after reading the letter. It was then he realized that the poetry books his wife had been reading were actually Sade's writings. All grudges old and new were now combined. And this time, even with the priest's protection, Sade had no chance of escape, and the water punishment that had never been carried out was now the perfect way to deal with Sade. After rounds of torment, Sade became as fragile as a featherless chick. At this moment, the maid came to him for help. She said she planned to leave this place, but before she went, she hoped Sade could tell her one last story. Since Sade's cell was guarded and he could not speak with her one-on-one, he came up with a pass-the-message method. Sade would speak one sentence, the patients would repeat it word for word, and eventually it would reach the maid so she could write it down. But some patients lacked the literacy to repeat the sentences exactly. However, Sade did not mind at all, because in his eyes, literature knew no boundaries. Perhaps with the added exaggeration of these rough men, the story's intensity would become even greater. But these patients were not only messengers, they were also listeners, and they were unstable listeners. As Sade described the scenes, several of them became increasingly agitated. One patient even set the room on fire. One spark created 1,000 waves, and the fire triggered collective chaos throughout the asylum. Amid the chaos, a heavy-set patient who had just passed on the message felt an evil impulse and acted out a violent scene from the story upon the maid. When the doctor heard her cries for help, he was the first to arrive, but instead of saving her, he quietly locked the door. This was his revenge on the priest. When the priest finally found the maid, her heart had already stopped forever. With the maid dead, the doctor seized a new excuse to punish Sade. He claimed that Sade's writing stirred harmful desires in others and was an unforgivable crime, deserving eternal imprisonment in the dungeon. Because of the maid's tragic death, the priest decided not to forgive Sade anymore. He ordered his men to cut off Sade's tongue, and they were not to use any anesthesia. After everything was done, he placed the severed tongue before the doctor. The priest went to the maid's body and sorrowfully looked at the cold face of the one he loved. Suddenly, the maid opened her eyes, touched the priest's cheeks, and the two embraced and kissed. But all of this was only in the priest's imagination. When a twisted fate breaks its floodgates, the priest looked toward the figure above. Those streams of bloody tears seemed to tell the priest that both the violation of the maid's body and the collapse of sacred belief had occurred. Yet while the priest struggled within his faith, a worker suddenly pushed open the door and told him that Sade was still writing. How could a person with no paper, no ink, and no tongue express his creative thoughts? Sade used his stubbornness to tell the world that the power of expression could never be blocked. Surrounded by a foul stench, the priest entered the dungeon and saw the walls covered with Sade's writing made from filth. The priest was moved by Sade's persistence, and the exhausted Sade finally reached the end of his life. The priest thought Sade would pass away peacefully under his prayers, but unexpectedly, Sade swallowed the cross in one bite. He preferred to choke himself rather than accept false redemption. When redemption becomes a weapon, the priest's last trace of faith completely collapsed. From then on, he vanished without a trace. A year later, the doctor had fully taken control of the asylum. Once he began ruling, the patients were stripped of entertainment and forced into grueling printing work instead. What they printed were all of Sade's writings from his lifetime. It turned out that political winds in France had shifted, and what was once contraband had now become mainstream publications. Naturally, the doctor profited greatly from Sade's remaining works. A new priest arrived at the asylum. The doctor told him that all the patients here were fairly normal, except for one who was incurably ill. That person was the former priest. He now lived in the cell where Sade once stayed. He longed to have a quill to write down what he had experienced, but the doctor would not give him that chance. However, after the doctor left, someone suddenly opened the small window at the bottom of the door. It was the maid's blind mother. She handed him a quill, white paper, and ink. The elderly woman had only one request.
Use it well. You owe her that.
The priest picked up the pen, knowing exactly what he had to write. But before beginning, he wanted to write a preface to tell the world who should read the story he was about to write and who should read it in secret. Quills is a film released in 2000, directed by Philip Kaufman and based on a biographical story. Looking at it today, the film's cast is astonishing. The lead actor is Geoffrey Rush, the captain from Pirates of the Caribbean. The leading actress is Kate Winslet, Rose from Titanic. In addition, Joaquin Phoenix appears, along with Michael Caine, the butler from Batman. Notably, Geoffrey Rush received both an Oscar nomination and a Golden Globe nomination for his outstanding portrayal of Sade. This fully proves his remarkable acting ability. Before watching this film, many people were simply seeking its provocative elements, but as they watched, they realized something was different. Not only was the expected allure gone, but the entire film felt like it was full of thorns. What pierced me the most was not just the life of a historical figure, but the struggle between art and authority. Sade was imprisoned in the asylum, yet he did everything he could to keep writing. The quill became his weapon of resistance, and ink became the blood of his thoughts. When all of it was taken away, he still searched for ways to express himself. This devotion to freedom deeply moved me. In the film, the priest formed a stark contrast with Sade. The priest represented reason and morality. He believed he could reform Sade through persuasion, but such reform was the death of thought. And if thought was already dead, then what meaning did this destination hold? As I pondered this question, the doctor used his authority to completely suppress dissenting voices. In the end, he used violence to erase everything that did not fit his standards. He also erased the debate between reason and freedom in my mind. Even today, the questions raised in Quills still matter. How much can society tolerate dangerous ideas? Are people like the doctor qualified to decide the limits of expression? The film gives no answers, but from Sade's tragedy, we can feel how absolute control devastates humanity. Throughout human history, many brave individuals used their pens to record the scars of their era, regardless of nationality or race. As long as humanity exists, the wild grass of free thought will never be fully burned away. A woman felt as if she were facing a guillotine simply because she glanced at an adult novel. Watching this scene, the Marquis de Sade immediately picked up his quill and wrote another shocking story because provocation was his nature. 200 years ago, during Europe's Age of Enlightenment, bold ideas flourished, and Sade became the leading figure of provocative literature. His obsession with forbidden themes repeatedly sent him to prison, until authorities finally locked him inside an asylum. Yet even there, he refused to stop writing. Sade secretly passed his manuscripts to a maid, who delivered them to publishers. His books spread across Paris and angered Napoleon, who ordered the doctor of the asylum to cure Sade at any cost. The doctor believed in punishment, not compassion, while the kind priest hoped Sade could be guided with reason. But Sade kept creating writing with wine on cloth, with blood on clothes, even using filth when everything else was taken away. For him, expression was life itself. Tragedy struck when chaos inside the asylum led to the maid's death. The doctor blamed Sade, and the priest, devastated by loss and shaken in faith, approved the cruel punishment that finally broke Sade's body but not his will. Sade died refusing false redemption. A year later, the doctor profited from publishing the very works he once condemned, while the priest, now labeled insane, was locked in Sade's former cell. Only the maid's blind mother secretly gave him a quill so he could write the truth.